Someone like you will never succeed." That's how he humiliated her in front of everyone at the bank. Years later, the unexpected happens. He returns, begging for a job. In today's video, you'll discover a story of incredible twists and resilience. After being cruelly put down while trying to pursue her dream, she finds the strength to move forward. But fate completely changes the game, and he, the man who once laughed at her, now needs her as his only chance. What happened to bring him here? What was the price of this twist? Stay until the end to uncover every detail of this powerful journey of redemption.
The sunlight was fading, giving way to the warm, golden glow of the small bakery's lights in a neighborhood of San Francisco. Linda, wearing a worn apron and her hair tied back in a simple bun, was reviewing the day's notes. The shelf with the few leftover loaves of bread, the crumpled bills beneath the cash register notebook. Each item symbolized the sweat she had poured into this place. Every remaining item represented yet another small step in her struggle for stability. She was organizing the last notes in the cash register when, raising her gaze, her attention was drawn to the entrance door. Linda recognized the man standing there immediately. Halston, the former manager of the bank where she had taken her first big fall, was staring intently at her. It was the same face, the same posture, but something was drastically different. The designer suit had been replaced by an old blazer, and the marks of time and fatigue were impossible to ignore on his face. Linda straightened slowly, still trying to process the situation. Under what circumstances would that man remember her bakery? 10 years earlier, Halston had been ruthless. At that time, he had rejected her loan application, laughing and mocking her dream of starting her own business. He didn't even pretend to hide his disdain. But now, standing there, he didn't seem the same. Halston was surveying the bakery, glancing around the interior with an expression that went beyond a mere visit. It was a mix of anxiety and perhaps even regret. Linda remained silent, watching him without knowing what to expect. Could this visit be some sort of provocation? A new criticism about the modest size of her venture? But Halston hesitated before entering, and for a moment she saw a flicker of insecurity in his eyes. She barely noticed the slight tremor in her own hands. After all, he was the last person she expected to see there. Halston finally crossed the threshold, walking hesitantly up to the counter. He looked out of place, as if that small space had put him in a vulnerable position he didn't know how to handle. Linda resisted the urge to cross her arms and assume a defensive stance. However, she couldn't completely hide the icy tone when she asked, "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" Halston lowered his head before responding, a behavior that was almost unimaginable in his former self. "Linda, I need a job." She blinked, absorbing the words while trying to find any hint of irony. Instead, she found only a sincere and embarrassed expression. Halston continued, "My life took a different turn. I lost my job, and this is all very new to me. The market, well, it's not exactly looking for someone like me, you know?" He paused, forcing a smile that came out shaky. "So I thought maybe I could start from the bottom, and I remembered you." Linda held her breath. He had humiliated her in the past. The image of disdain in Halston's eyes when she left the bank empty-handed never left her mind. That same mouth that once said people like you wouldn't have what it takes to succeed was now pleading for an opportunity. What had happened to bring him to this point? Linda took a deep breath and let her gaze wander around the bakery, reflecting for a few moments. She could easily reject Halston, simply dismiss him, just as he had done to her in the past. It would be a fair response. But at the same time, there was something there. Something that challenged her to do differently. After all, she had always believed that her success came from a force greater than pride. "All right," she finally replied, crossing her arms and watching his reaction. "I'll give you a chance, but no handouts. You'll start with cleaning, organizing the stock. Deal? If you're not willing, the door's right there." Halston raised his gaze, surprised by the offer. He seemed more relieved than he had expected, as if the burden of pride had finally lifted. "I accept. It won't be a problem." "I'll do whatever it takes, Linda," he said, a brief smile appearing on his face. Without another word, Linda turned away, beginning to organize the cleaning supplies. She didn't know where this situation would lead them, but one thing was certain. Halston, who had once belittled her, was now starting his journey with what many would consider a humiliation. Linda wondered if he was truly prepared for what lay ahead, and if he would be willing to confront a new reality where the old power no longer existed, and more importantly, how long he would maintain that effort. Linda didn't know, but as she closed the bakery that night, she realized there were more questions hanging in the air than answers. Linda paced back and forth in the bakery, rearranging a few items while occasionally stealing glances at Halston. Every detail of her past with him resurfaced like a movie, especially the fateful day when she, insecure and inexperienced, sought financial support to open the bakery. The bank building, a concrete block that felt miles away from reality, contrasted sharply with the small bakery Linda dreamed of opening. She wasn't naive. She knew her loan request wouldn't be easy to secure, but it was her dream. Halston received her in a room with white walls and large windows, where he, then a manager, exuded impeccable authority, dressed in a suit that seemed tailor-made for him. Linda barely had the chance to present her plan. Halston examined the papers with a look of near boredom. With every word she spoke, he frowned, sighing between sentences, until he interrupted her. "Look, dear," he said with a tone that made it sound like he was explaining the obvious to someone very ignorant. "Do you really believe that a bakery in this neighborhood would have a chance? Especially with the financial history you presented. People like you don't have what it takes to sustain a business like this." Linda swallowed hard, realizing that his "people like you" didn't just refer to her history, but something deeper, a disdain that seemed rooted. She clutched the folder against her chest, trying to maintain her composure while he listed the reasons why she should never take such a risk. He didn't even bother to formally reject her. He simply dismissed her papers and called for the next person. That moment was a turning point. As she left the bank, Linda walked through the city center with quick steps, almost fleeing. She didn't know where she was going, but she needed to move, breathe, process everything she had heard. San Francisco seemed to swallow her. The city pulsed around her with the noise of cars, the voices of people, and the cold wind of the late afternoon. It was overwhelming. Halston's words echoed in her mind, repeating like a sentence of defeat. Yet amidst that internal storm, something began to shift. In the days that followed, Linda realized that the anger she felt toward Halston and his words didn't fade away. On the contrary, it transformed into fuel. With the little she had saved and personal loans from friends and family, she began investing in the essentials to open her bakery. It was a struggle. Every cent counted, every mistake costing more than she could afford. She had no bank support, but she worked twice as hard to achieve everything on her own. After months of relentless work and sacrificed hours of sleep, the bakery finally opened its doors. It was a modest space, simple, with shelves made from repurposed wood and a small area for customers. Linda knew the place still needed a lot to compete with larger establishments, but for her, it was a start. Every time she entered and smelled the fresh bread, it felt like a silent victory over the disdain Halston had thrown at her. As the years passed, the bakery became a well-known spot in the neighborhood. Linda worked from dawn until dusk, personally serving each customer, learning their stories, and building connections. Success didn't come quickly, but it was built little by little. She never forgot where she came from and how hard she fought to get there. And even though she had overcome so many challenges, Halston's gaze still haunted her thoughts, a constant reminder that someone had once doubted her to the point of trying to crush her dreams. Now seeing him there working in her bakery, so worn and distressed, Linda felt a strange mix of justice and discomfort. The bank flashback was so vivid that Linda felt her muscles tense every time she recalled that experience. But now, watching him awkwardly clean the bakery floor with clumsy, uncoordinated movements and a weary expression, the sensation was a strange mix of satisfaction and discomfort. Halston seemed to be struggling with something as simple as mopping the floor. He adjusted the bucket, soaked the cloth, and twisted it tightly, but his gestures still reflected an air of superiority, as if it were a burden for him to bend that way. He moved slowly, carefully, with his gaze down but in silence, aware of the place he occupied now. Linda approached to observe more closely. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of irony. He glanced at her, surprised, but didn't respond. He returned to his task, more focused, but Linda noticed his hand trembling. She turned away and tried to return to her own work, but the discomfort wouldn't subside. Seeing him like this wasn't exactly revenge. It was something deeper. He was a reflection of everything she had ever felt. It was as if her entire past was twisting before her, in a person who could no longer uphold his pride. As she watched that worn man struggling to clean the floor, Linda realized that fate, in an ironic twist, had shown Halston the weight of failure, the same weight he had emphasized she would feel when she left the bank years ago. But now, in the face of the situation, she didn't know if she felt fully satisfied or deeply uncomfortable. There was a crack in the past that wouldn't be resolved with just that scene. Linda continued to observe Halston, and as strange as it seemed, she found herself questioning what could have happened to bring him to this situation. After all, someone who once commanded a bank like that wouldn't just fall so quickly. It was as if something had drained him from the inside out, and Linda realized it wasn't just professional failure that marked his face. It was something deeper. She walked past the stockroom, where he was bent over, cleaning the lower shelves. Seeing him there, an almost irritating curiosity overtook her. She approached slowly, stopping at a distance he didn't notice, and asked a question that seemed inevitable to her. "What happened, Halston?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, but it also wasn't filled with compassion. It was simply a direct question. Halston paused his movement, took a deep breath, and for a moment Linda thought he wouldn't respond. But then he sighed, remaining with his back to her as he spoke. "Things happened, Linda. Things that I once thought were very distant from me. I lost my job at the bank. My wife filed for divorce. And then, well, I was trying to hold on to what was left. And I found myself, for the first time, with nothing, with no one." She noted the weight in his words and found herself confronted with the image of a man who, contrary to what she thought, was being forced to face his failures in the worst possible way. Turning her face toward him, she noticed something she would never expect to see, an almost vacant look, as if the energy he once flaunted so much had now been drained. She watched him in silence, wondering if she was truly ready to deal with the whole situation. Halston was a transformed man, yes, but there was still something in his gaze that seemed trapped, something he wasn't revealing. Linda didn't know if he was being sincere or if, deep down, this was just another facade to gain some credit. She stepped back, doubts growing in her mind as a new thought formed. What else might he be hiding?
If you're enjoying this story of resilience and transformation, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like, and comment. It's really important for the growth of the channel and helps us bring more inspiring stories. Let's continue with the next chapter.
Halston's first days at the bakery were not easy. Linda watched him as he faced the routine with a mix of reluctance and effort. He seemed determined, but the tension in his face revealed the frustration he was trying to hide. Halston had always been a man accustomed to command, order, and precision, someone who valued the respect his position at the bank afforded him. Now, in a humble and unprestigious role, everything seemed to go wrong. The bakery staff, noticing his rigid posture and meticulous manner, quickly lost patience with him. Mike, the young assistant in the kitchen, was the first to cast disdainful glances. Watching Halston fumble with the stock, he muttered things like, "Who does he think he is?" Or, "Working in a bakery isn't as simple as counting money, you know?" Halston pretended not to hear, but Linda could see the muscles in his face tightening, struggling to contain his wounded pride. One day, while Halston was cleaning the floor near the counter, an elderly customer walked in and observed him for a few seconds. With an air of someone who had known the place for decades, she frowned at the new employee and made a harsh comment. "You don't seem to have a knack for this. Do you know what you're doing, or are you just here to take a vacation?" she said with a cruel smile. Halston opened his mouth as if ready to respond, but held back. Instead, he mumbled something inaudible and continued scrubbing the floor. His expression was clear. Every word, every look of disdain struck him deeply. He seemed to be fighting to remember that he needed this opportunity, even at the cost of his pride. From a safe distance, Linda began to question whether he would be able to endure the pressure that lay ahead. Linda kept a close watch on Halston. More than monitoring him, she was curious. In fact, she hadn't expected him to last this long. She thought he would give up once he faced the difficulties of the job and the disdain of his colleagues and customers. But as the days passed, something surprised her. He remained silent, enduring the provocations and contempt, as if he knew deep down that he himself was partly to blame for all of it. She watched him as he organized some boxes in the small back room. His movements were careful and precise, and she saw how hard he was trying to learn the routine. At times, Mike would come in with an air of superiority, pointing out details or correcting his work with a biting tone. "Hey, Halston, if you keep staring at those boxes, they won't organize themselves, you know?" Mike mocked, walking away soon after. To Linda's surprise, Halston simply nodded and returned to his task. In the past, she was sure he would have responded, full of arrogance, with the kind of posture that insisted he was always right. But he just continued working, his expression becoming increasingly withdrawn. For Linda, this behavior didn't make sense. It was as if he was willing to absorb every reprimand, every rude comment. This made her question her assumptions without clear answers. She knew Halston was proud and vain, and that this job felt like a punishment the world had imposed on him. Yet here he was, patient, accepting criticism and commands from people who, in another time, wouldn't have dared to speak to him. This new demeanor was something she never thought she would witness, and that thought intensified Linda's curiosity. It was the end of the workday, and Linda was checking the accounts for the day when she heard Halston's voice in the back of the bakery. He was cleaning the counter area, which was his last duty of the day, but he seemed hesitant, as though waiting for the right moment to say something. When she noticed the silence, she looked up and saw Halston standing there, staring at the floor. He appeared to be choosing his words carefully before speaking, and Linda sensed that this was an uncomfortable situation for him too. "Linda, he began, his voice low, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I never thought I'd be here, you know. When you left the bank years ago, I was unfair. I know that now, but I never imagined that one day I would truly understand what that meant." She simply watched him, still silent. He took a deep breath, and what followed came in a tone she hadn't expected. "I lost more than a job, Linda. I lost everything," he confessed, a hint of desperation in his voice. "My wife, my home. I lost everything that made sense to me, and I know that none of this matters to you. But I know what it's like to see everything disappear and to be left alone." Linda noticed the subtle tremor in his voice, and the weight of his words began to settle in. It wasn't just about the job or professional failure. He had lost all the emotional support he had for years, and now he seemed to understand the pain and loneliness that had never touched him before. Halston kept his head down, perhaps waiting for a word of understanding or simply the release from the burden he had created for himself. For her, it was impossible not to see a broken man there. Her first reaction was a mix of anger and empathy, but what troubled her most was the feeling that, little by little, she was beginning to understand Halston beyond the job at the bank or the disdain of the past could explain. Linda looked at him and felt for the first time that this was a truly remorseful man, someone forced to transform in a way he could never have imagined. The weight of that silence between them felt like a turning point, something that would change the course of their coexistence. After all, who was this man now? The next day dawned like any other for Halston, but something about Linda seemed different. By the end of their shift, as he was cleaning the service area, she appeared behind the counter, watching him with a serious yet contemplative expression. Halston straightened up, expecting a comment about his work or another instruction. But Linda simply stared at him, and when she finally spoke, her tone was almost confidential. "Halston, would you like to join me for something today?" she asked while observing him fold the cloth. He furrowed his brow, hesitating. After everything, he still wasn't sure he understood her intentions, but he felt that this invitation was more of a test. "Where to?" he asked, trying to disguise the uncertainty in his voice. Linda grabbed a large bag she had stored in the kitchen and placed it on the counter. Inside, he saw bread, cakes, and packages of freshly baked cookies. Halston looked at the bag and then back at Linda, confused. She noticed the curiosity in his eyes and, without delay, explained, "Every week I distribute this food to some people in need." And after a calculated pause, she added, "Homeless people living on the streets. It's something I do in secret. Every week, I distribute this food to some people in need." And after a calculated pause, she added, "Homeless people living on the streets. It's something I do in secret." That caught him off guard. He looked down at the floor, thoughtful, before nodding. "Sure, I can help, yes," he said, not entirely sure why he had accepted, but perhaps it was because of her determined tone. Linda handed him the bag and took another for herself. They left the bakery together, heading toward a more remote area of San Francisco, where the bright lights and upscale shops gave way to dark sidewalks and people huddled under old blankets. The change was abrupt, and Halston quickly realized the harshness of the scene. He had avoided those areas for years, but now, guided by Linda, he felt exposed to a reality he had previously distanced himself from. As they walked, Linda seemed to know every corner, every face in despair. Their first stop was under a bridge, where small groups of people gathered, seeking shelter from the biting wind. She pulled a loaf of bread from the bag and extended it to a middle-aged man, who greeted her with a tired yet grateful smile. Linda chatted briefly with them, calling some by name, asking how they were doing. It was as if she were a familiar figure there, someone who brought a bit of comfort amid that harsh reality. Halston, on the other hand, felt disconcerted. He handed out the first loaves almost without looking at the people, realizing that his presence there was uncomfortable, both for him and for the residents. But something shifted when an older man, wearing a tattered coat and clutching a torn blanket, thanked Halston with a sincere smile and shook his hand. "Thank you, sir. You don't know how much this means to us," said the man with a hoarse, choked voice. Those words penetrated Halston in an unexpectedly profound way. He found himself looking at the man with a mix of compassion and discomfort, remembering that for him these people had once been invisible. For a moment he felt a weight in his chest as he realized how limited he had been, so obsessed with controlling his own life that he had completely ignored the existence of so many others around him. As he handed out the last loaves, he noticed the expressions of gratitude on the faces of the people and felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't pity, but a raw sense of humanity, a reminder that those people were as real and vulnerable as he was. In that instant, Halston understood that his own arrogance had deprived him of that connection for his entire life. The walk back to the bakery was silent until Halston, unable to contain his curiosity, broke the quiet. "Linda, can I ask you something? Why do you do this? I mean, distributing food like this, without expecting anything in return?" His voice was filled with doubt, but also genuine respect, an admiration he hadn't anticipated feeling. Linda stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. Her gaze was firm, but there was a certain sadness behind it. She took a deep breath before responding, her words carefully chosen. "Because I know what it's like to go hungry, Halston. I know what it's like to sleep on the street, not knowing what the next day will bring." He blinked, surprised. Linda? On the streets? The image he had of her, the strong, determined woman who ran the bakery with such pride, didn't match what she had just described. "I never told you because it's not easy to remember," she continued. "When I came to San Francisco, I had no one. I wanted to build something, but no one believed in me. So I worked where I could, slept where I could, and even went days without eating, until I finally had the chance to start over." She paused, and Halston felt the weight of her words. Everything he had perceived about her until then seemed to unravel. Linda was indeed a survivor, someone who had faced a reality far harsher than he could imagine. She looked away, surveying the city around them before continuing. "So after I managed to open the bakery, I decided I would never let another person go through that without help, if it was within my reach." Halston nodded slowly, absorbing this new image of Linda. She wasn't just an ambitious businesswoman, a survivor. She was someone who understood the value of compassion on a much deeper level than he could ever comprehend, and he found himself thinking about how many times in the past he might have ignored or even disdained someone like Linda, someone who to him was just another person. When they reached the door of the bakery, the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but filled with a new mutual understanding. Linda opened the door, and Halston entered quietly, knowing that this experience had left an indelible mark on him. After all, he was beginning to realize that this job at the bakery could be more than just a chance for redemption. Perhaps it was the beginning of something he hadn't even known he was searching for. The next morning, Linda decided it was time to expand Halston's responsibilities. She found him at the bakery, already setting up the tables and cleaning the floor. He caught sight of her out of the corner of his eye, lifting his gaze with a weariness that had become characteristic, yet he offered no complaints. "Halston, come with me. I'm going to teach you something different today," she said, heading to the kitchen. He frowned, intrigued but silent as he followed her. The kitchen was the heart of the bakery, a cramped space filled with pots, pans, and ingredients carefully arranged. Linda opened the pantry and began gathering ingredients: flour, sugar, yeast. He watched attentively, unsure of what to expect. "We're going to make bread, and just so you know, I won't go easy on you. There's no room for mistakes here," she warned, handing him an apron. He hesitated, clearly not expecting this and evidently having never really gotten his hands dirty before. Under Linda's watchful eye, he began measuring the flour, spilling some out of the bowl. She corrected him, instructing with patience, though she couldn't hide her demanding gaze. He continued to try to keep up, mixing ingredients and kneading the dough awkwardly, but his expression betrayed his frustration at not mastering the technique. After several frustrating attempts, Halston began to feel anxious, but Linda urged him to stay calm and keep going. The first batch came out looking strange. Some loaves were oddly shaped, and he noticed Linda's effort to hold back a sharp comment. Even so, she recognized his genuine effort, which unexpectedly moved her to be a bit more patient. By the end of the morning, despite the mistakes and clumsiness, she realized he was truly dedicated, and that touched her in a way she hadn't anticipated. That afternoon, as they were closing up the bakery, Linda suggested they talk a little. She pointed to an empty table by the window and they sat down, relaxed for the first time. It felt strange for both of them. After all, their interactions had been marked by a palpable formality and tension. "You know, I never imagined I'd be here," Halston remarked with a bittersweet smile. "I never thought I'd learn to make bread, or that it would interest me in any way." Linda looked at him, curious. She sensed that in leaving his old world behind, he had left something much deeper in the past. After a moment of silence, Halston sighed and revealed, "After my wife filed for divorce, everything started to crumble. I lost my job, friends disappeared, and my kids—" He paused, his voice cracking. "Well, they never forgave me. I was so absent. To them, I've always been a stranger." Linda sat in silence, observing the man before her in a new light. For the first time, she didn't see the arrogant Halston who had once humiliated her, but rather someone broken by his own choices. The despair in his eyes was undeniable, and the guilt he carried seemed genuine. She realized that the weight he bore went far beyond his current situation. What he had lost was irreplaceable. "I'm really sorry, Halston," she said plainly, her sincerity unexpected. His vulnerability in that confession struck her, shattering an invisible barrier that had existed between the two. She realized that, despite everything, he seemed truly remorseful and was indeed trying to change. For the first time, she saw him as a human being, not just the symbol of pain he had carried for so long. Perhaps after all, everyone deserved a second chance, even him. The next day, the bakery was bustling. A group of tourists had entered, excited about the local products, lining up to buy freshly baked breads and pastries. Linda, accustomed to the hustle, organized everything quickly, but Halston, still trying to adapt, dashed around trying to keep up. She instructed him to help with customer service, and without hesitation, he took on the role. An elderly lady approached the counter and asked for a specific type of bread. Wanting to be helpful, Halston went to fetch the order, but as he tried to serve the customer, he clumsily dropped a tray of just-baked bread, scattering it all over the floor. The noise drew everyone's attention, and the room fell into an awkward silence. He looked at Linda, his face flushed, trying to contain his embarrassment. Linda clenched her jaw, visibly irritated. She approached him with firm steps, quickly picking up the bread from the floor and indicating that he should step aside. He obeyed, looking like a child being scolded. Linda took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. But it was hard. The loss was significant, and for the first time, she found herself questioning whether he was really capable of doing the job. "Halston, maybe you're not ready for this," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. He stood still, staring at her with a mix of regret and frustration. For the first time since they began working together, the atmosphere between them cooled drastically, and doubt hung in the air. Halston felt completely devastated. The incident with the tray still echoed in his mind, bringing back all the doubts about his abilities and place in that environment. That public humiliation and Linda's disapproving gaze haunted him. He had already lost everything, but this new defeat hurt in a different way. For the first time, he found himself in a position where failure didn't stem from big financial decisions, but from something much simpler and more intimate. He had failed to earn the trust of someone who, unexpectedly, was beginning to mean something to him. That night, sitting on his modest bed in a small rented apartment, he contemplated giving up. The thought was tempting, but then he remembered all the other doors that had closed on him. The need was real. He had no choice but to stay. If he gave up now, he would lose his only source of income, and also the only chance he had to rebuild himself. Even feeling ashamed, he decided that if he was going to continue, he would have to do so with more commitment than before. He couldn't fail again. The next morning, Halston arrived at the bakery before Linda and began organizing everything down to the smallest detail. Gradually, he understood that each item had a specific function, and that order mattered there as much as the flavor of the products. He learned to handle the trays carefully and to prepare the display case, observing how Linda arranged things to make the environment welcoming. Even without exchanging many words with her, he felt her watching him, and her silence seemed like a tacit permission for him to try again. Each day at the bakery became a personal challenge, and he could no longer let the fear of failure hold him back. As the days passed, Linda began to notice Halston's commitment. Unlike at the beginning, when he seemed to do only the bare minimum, he was now fully engaged. Halston arrived before her, meticulously cleaned the utensils, and even offered to help with the details of bread preparation. Linda found herself surprised by his transformation. The man who had once seemed arrogant and distant was now dedicated to learning and improving. Seeing his determination, Linda decided he was ready for a new step. That day, at the end of the shift, she called Halston over for a conversation and with a serious tone announced, "I want you to close the bakery today, just you." He stood still for a second, absorbing the responsibility implied in that request. Closing the bakery was more than a routine task. It was a job that required trust. Linda was placing him in a position of responsibility, something that felt unbelievable to him. Halston tried to maintain a neutral expression, but he couldn't hide the gratitude in his eyes. He nodded, agreeing, while Linda passed him the detailed instructions for closing, checking the register, inspecting the equipment, turning off the lights. Later, when Linda left and the bakery was empty, he found himself alone with his thoughts. The silence of the place felt like a confirmation of the new chance he was receiving. Every detail she had taught him echoed in his mind, and he followed the closing ritual to the letter with intense concentration, almost reverently. That night, as he locked the door for the first time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of purpose. A few days later, while closing the bakery for the second time alone, Halston decided to stop for coffee at the diner across the street before heading home. The place was small and discreet, and he thought that the anonymity there would help him relax. Sitting at the counter, he took a sip of coffee and watched the streets of San Francisco, reflecting on how much his life had changed in recent months. He still struggled to see himself in this new routine, but at the same time, he felt relieved to at least have a place where he was needed. As he observed the street, he heard a familiar voice that made him freeze. "Halston, is that really you?" He turned slowly, recognizing the well-dressed figure gazing at him with a mocking smile. It was an old colleague from the bank, Mark, whom he hadn't seen since being fired. Mark was in a tailored suit and wore an expression of superiority that Halston knew all too well. It was the same expression he himself had worn before his downfall. "What are you doing here?" Mark asked, eyeing him with a mix of curiosity and contempt. "Just having a coffee," Halston replied, not wanting to divulge any details. Mark stepped closer, laughing casually but with a biting tone. "I heard you're working at a bakery. I never thought I'd see the great Halston dealing with bread and flour. Who would have thought, right? The world really turns." Halston felt his blood boil, but he took a deep breath. Mark's words stung his pride, but he knew he couldn't respond the way he would have before. He looked at his former colleague and, with a calmness he didn't know he possessed, replied, "Yes, I am. And you know it's honest work. It's much more than I was doing before, surprisingly." Mark let out a dry laugh, incredulous, but Halston maintained his composure. In that moment, he realized that his life had changed on a level Mark would never understand. Linda, the bakery, the people who cared, all of it was part of something larger, something he now valued. He understood that he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. When he finished his coffee, Halston said goodbye to Mark and left the diner, feeling a huge weight lift off his shoulders. As he crossed the street and passed by the closed bakery, he looked at the illuminated sign and felt a mix of gratitude and responsibility. More and more, he knew it was not just a job. For the first time, he wanted to prove to Linda and to himself that he was capable of becoming a better person.
If this story has you hooked and you're eager to know how it ends, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support is essential for the growth of the channel. Now let's dive back into the story.
That night, the bakery was closed, but the lights were still on. Linda and Halston had finished their shift, and the silence inside created an almost intimate atmosphere. It was as if the weight of all the unspoken words hung over them. Halston, as usual, was putting away the utensils in the kitchen and checking the stock, but his pace was slower, distracted. Linda noticed this, and there was something she needed to address, a feeling trapped inside her for a long time. "Halston, can I talk to you?" Linda asked, hesitating but firm. He stopped, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked at her. Linda's gaze was intense, filled with a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. She took a deep breath, feeling the memories of that day at the bank surge again, like an open wound. "I never told you how much your words that day affected me, but today I think it's time," she began, not breaking eye contact. "You weren't just cruel to me, Halston. The way you looked at me, the disdain in your voice, it haunted me for years. It made me believe I was less, that my dream was a joke." Halston listened in silence, his face paling. Each of her words hit him like a slap, but he didn't try to justify himself. He simply lowered his head, absorbing the intensity of what she was saying. Finally, he looked her in the eyes, and Linda noticed something different. He seemed stripped of all pretense. "I'm sorry, Linda. I can't change what I did, but I know I was wrong. For a long time I clung to an idea of superiority, as if my position made me better than others." He swallowed hard, his voice low and hesitant. "I was an empty, arrogant man, and I paid dearly for that. I deeply regret it." The sincerity in his voice was a shock to Linda, and at that moment she realized that for the first time, he wasn't trying to impress her. It was an apology that seemed to arise from real pain, and surprisingly, that touched her more than she could have imagined. The conversation evolved, the tone becoming increasingly vulnerable. They both shared experiences they had kept to themselves, and Linda began to realize that, despite all the pain and hurt, perhaps there was something in common between them: the consequences of choices that had shaped their lives in irreversible ways. "You know, Halston, what surprises me the most is that, in part, you made me stronger. The day I left that bank I was destroyed, but something in me changed forever. And as much as I hated you, it was because of that I moved on," she confessed, her voice sounding both painful and resigned. Halston watched her, understanding the weight of those words. He took a deep breath before responding. "Linda, when I lost my job, I lost everything that sustained my vanity. The truth is, I always believed my position defined me, that it made me special. But when it all collapsed, I realized there was no one by my side. My children, they barely talked to me. My ex-wife completely distanced herself, and the only thing that remained was a deep pain, a void I caused myself." Linda felt something new stir within her, genuine empathy, an understanding she never thought she would feel for Halston. Seeing him talk about the mistakes and regrets he carried, she recognized someone who was indeed trying to rebuild his values. He was no longer the same man from the bank. He was broken, yes, but there was a sincerity, a humility that she would never have associated with him before. A silence enveloped the place until Linda, surprising herself, placed her hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. She forgave him, not for the words spoken, but because he was willing to be a better person. For the first time, she felt the bitterness beginning to dissipate. With the newfound peace between them, Linda decided they could do more together. She stepped away for a moment, going to the kitchen, where she grabbed a crumpled sheet of paper. She returned and handed the paper to Halston, who, intrigued, unfolded it. It was a list of basic items: bread, cakes, cookies, milk. "What is this?" he asked, confused. "It's a list of what we need to put together food baskets, not just for the homeless, but for families in the neighborhood who are struggling," she explained, observing his reaction. "I was thinking about expanding our donations." I know many are going through tough times, and I think we can help in a more consistent way." He absorbed the idea, his eyes shining with new energy. This was an opportunity to do something meaningful, to use his time and work for something beyond himself. For so many years, Halston had focused exclusively on his accomplishments and how much he was admired. Now, the idea of contributing, of being there for others, seemed so much more significant. "Do you really want me to be part of this?" he asked, still in disbelief. Linda smiled gently, nodding her head. "Yes, Halston. I think it's time we start something new, something that really makes a difference. I want you to help me lead this project." The proposal took him by surprise, but he accepted it with gratitude and determination. It was a chance to start over, to find a new purpose amidst so much regret. He knew it would be difficult, that it would be a long road, but this was the opportunity he needed, and in a way, he felt he was also helping to rebuild Linda's trust. As they looked over the list together, planning the first donations, Halston knew that he had finally found something he could call redemption. With the decision made, Linda and Halston dedicated themselves to organizing the bakery as a support point for those in need. Their first task was to ensure there were enough supplies not only to sell products, but also to assemble food baskets for local families in vulnerable situations. Linda knew some of these families. They were customers who had suddenly disappeared from the bakery when times got tough, and she was aware there were many other cases. This new project would bring these people back, but in a way that honored the dignity of everyone involved. Halston, now wearing a determined expression that Linda had never seen before, listed contacts and ideas to make the project public. They agreed to call the initiative Bread for All. To this end, they invited local suppliers and even other merchants on the street to get involved. With the support of nearby grocery stores and restaurants, it didn't take long for the baskets to come to life. They stacked packages of fresh bread, cakes, fruits, and some essential items. Word of mouth did the rest. Within a few days, people began to stop by the bakery, both to pick up a donation basket and to offer support, whether in the form of money, food, or volunteer work. The movement only grew. Halston took charge of organizing the baskets and, surprisingly, seemed to have a knack for attracting help, encouraging everyone to get involved. The humility he now displayed was evident to all, and his effort to build something positive seemed to inspire others in a way he had never managed before. The bakery transformed. The donation baskets were meticulously arranged, and the mornings were marked by a steady flow of people coming and going, some seeking support, and others simply coming to express their gratitude. The work was intense, but for Linda and Halston, the feeling of doing something so meaningful outweighed the fatigue. With the project's success, Halston found, for the first time in many years, a sense of purpose. He woke up early, sometimes even before Linda, and dedicated himself wholeheartedly to the tasks. He helped in the oven, organized the donations, and made sure every detail was in order. Linda noticed he poured all his energy into the project. The man she once knew as arrogant and distant had suddenly become someone deeply engaged in the life of the neighborhood, creating connections he never imagined he would establish. On a particularly busy afternoon, Linda found herself watching Halston with silent admiration. He was talking to a family that was there for the first time, asking where they were from and how they could organize to ensure they never ran out of food. She felt that he wasn't just trying to help, he truly understood the pain of those people. His dedication and the way he treated the needy awakened something in Linda, something that surprised her. That night, as they closed the bakery together, Linda called out to him, "Halston, you've changed in a way I never expected. What you're doing here day after day shows a strength that I never thought I'd see." He gave a slight smile, a sincere smile that for a brief moment left Linda taken aback. "Thank you, Linda, and thank you for giving me a second chance, for giving me a new reason to wake up in the morning," he said straightforwardly. This project, which had started as a timid idea, was now becoming the center of their lives, Each day was an opportunity to witness the transformation they were making in the lives of others, reinforcing the connection between them. For Linda, there were no longer any doubts that Halston was genuinely changed. And for him, every gesture, every smile from the people they helped represented a chance for redemption. The Bread for All project had already spread throughout the neighborhood, and more people were coming to the bakery both to contribute and to seek assistance. On a busy afternoon, as Halston organized the baskets, Linda answered the doorbell. Upon opening the door, she saw a young man around 20 years old, standing there, looking around as if trying to absorb every detail of the place. He appeared nervous, with his hands in his pockets and a wary expression. Halston approached to see who it was, but upon looking at the young man, he froze. Linda immediately noticed. The young man had the same expression as Halston, the same eyes. She didn't need explanations to understand who he was. "Nathan?" Halston murmured, incredulous. The young man nodded, his expression tense and his eyes fixed on Halston. Sensing the intensity of the moment, Linda discreetly stepped back to give them space. Halston took a few steps forward but hesitated. Nathan was watching him, and the silence between them seemed to fill every corner of the bakery. Halston took a deep breath and broke the silence. "I didn't expect to see you here, son." Nathan hesitated but soon replied, "I didn't expect to be here either, but someone told me about the work you've been doing. I thought it was a lie. That this wasn't true," he said, looking around confused. Halston moved closer, his eyes misty. He never expected his son to return, much less to be there, witnessing his efforts. "Nathan, I have no excuses. I was a terrible father, but what I'm trying to do here, I hope it means something to you," he said, his voice choked. The young man took a deep breath, looking away. The hurt was evident, but he was there. Something Halston had never imagined. "I just want to know if you really changed," Nathan said, his voice heavy with distrust, but also a small thread of hope. Linda watched from a distance, her heart racing at the sight of their reunion. For Halston, this was the chance for reconciliation he had longed for. And for the first time, Linda saw in his eyes a glimpse of the man he always wanted to be. Nathan's presence in the bakery had been a turning point for Halston. The reunion with his son, laden with pain and uncertainty, transformed into a new impetus in his life. In the following days, Halston seemed more determined than ever. He was no longer the same man. Regret and redemption had reshaped him. Now he understood that he had a mission. After years of pride and arrogance, he had finally found a purpose that extended beyond himself. He began to observe the bakery with a visionary eye, noticing the potential for the Bread for All project to expand and help even more people. One calm afternoon, while preparing the donation baskets in the kitchen, he called Linda for a serious conversation. "Linda," he began, with a tone of enthusiasm she rarely saw in him. "I've been thinking, why don't we expand the project? We can go beyond food baskets and offer a larger structure. A new community bakery where anyone can come and eat without needing to pay if they can't." Linda, listening intently, crossed her arms, studying his face. That idea took her by surprise, but she could see in the sparkle of Halston's eyes that he was determined. She thought of all the people they had already helped and imagined how much further they could go. "And where do you think we should do this?" she asked, a hint of curiosity and apprehension in her voice. "In the old workshop next door. It's been closed for months and the rent isn't too high. We can renovate it together with the help of some volunteers. It would be an open space where people can come, eat, and even learn how to make bread," he explained, with an almost youthful enthusiasm. Linda pondered. Seeing that side of Halston, that genuine desire to do something positive, touched her deeply. She knew there were risks, but she also understood that this project meant much more to him than just a simple community action. It was Halston's chance to truly rise again, and at the same time, make a difference for so many others. With a smile, she extended her hand to him. "So we have a new project, partner," she said with a lightness that surprised even her. The following days were filled with intense activity. Halston and Linda coordinated volunteers to renovate the old workshop next to the bakery. It was hard work, fixing plumbing, painting walls, installing counters and ovens, but every detail seemed to add a new layer of purpose to the place. The community bakery was taking shape. Linda saw Halston's dedication in every step of the renovation. He committed himself, often more than necessary, spending hours perfecting details with a care she never imagined she would witness. At the same time, Linda began to see him in a new light. They were now working side by side, sharing ideas, laughing through the challenges, and she realized that for the first time he was more than just a presence in the bakery. He was someone with a story of transformation, someone she deeply respected. One night, after yet another long day of work, they found themselves alone in the new space, sitting on the floor surrounded by paint cans and brushes. Halston looked at Linda, a tired but happy smile on his face. "Linda, I never could have imagined all of this," he said sincerely. "In the past, nothing I did was for others, but now I feel like, well, I've finally found something real." Linda returned the smile, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You've managed to find what you needed, Halston. Now it's our turn to bring this to others." The connection between them was stronger than ever. Linda felt that together they could face any obstacle that arose. And for the first time she realized that Halston was not just her partner. He was a friend, someone who shared the same vision and passion for the impact they could make. The big day of the inauguration arrived. The new community bakery was immaculate, every detail carefully organized to welcome the community. People began arriving early, curious and excited to see the result of the project Linda and Halston had built. The banner with the name "Bread for All" was stretched across the facade, and the aroma of fresh bread wafted through the air, drawing in more and more people. Linda and Halston greeted visitors with smiles, explaining how the new space would work, where anyone, regardless of their situation, could come to share a meal or learn more about baking. The community's response was immediate. Families, mothers with children, young people, and the elderly all seemed impressed and grateful. Linda saw the expression of pride and happiness on Halston's face, and she couldn't help but smile seeing him so fulfilled. Suddenly, a group of local residents and shopkeepers approached. They carried posters and a wooden plaque, and before Halston and Linda knew it, they began organizing a small tribute to the two. Someone made a brief speech, thanking them for their dedication and the impact the project had made in the neighborhood, and soon others joined in, each expressing their gratitude. Halston stood still, visibly moved, as the words of thanks reached him, making him understand that at last his life had changed. At the end, a woman from the community approached Halston and handed him the plaque. He read the engraved words, "To those who rise again and make goodness flourish." Halston looked at Linda, his eyes misty, and for the first time, he felt at peace, aware that thanks to her generosity he had truly transformed. Linda smiled back, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new and long journey for both of them. Months after its opening, the community bakery Bread for All had become a true beacon of hope for families in the neighborhood. The activity there began early each morning, with residents, volunteers, and even small business owners gathering to ensure the bread was fresh, the products were organized, and everything was ready to welcome those in need of assistance. The bakery was no longer just a place for food. It had become a symbol of unity and resilience. Linda and Halston worked side by side every morning, managing the intense flow of people coming not only for nourishment, but also for a bit of comfort and community. With each basket distributed, they exchanged knowing smiles, aware that their project not only fed the body, but also nourished the spirits of those who walked through the doors. The walls of the new space, decorated with photographs of the neighborhood, now displayed thank you notes, messages of hope, and small contributions from the beneficiaries themselves. For Linda, Seeing the impact they were making brought a quiet but profound satisfaction. Halston's transformation, on the other hand, was visible to everyone. He dedicated himself as if this project were his own redemption, a concrete testament to his liberation from the past. It was common to see him sitting with elderly patrons, listening to their stories, or helping children pack donations. The bond between him and Linda had evolved into something so genuine and strong that each other's presence now felt indispensable. They were undoubtedly not just partners or friends, but allies in a cause that had changed them forever. On a quiet night, after a long day of work, Halston and Linda sat on one of the benches in the bakery as the last volunteer closed the door. The fatigue was evident on their faces, but at the same time, a sense of accomplishment enveloped them. Halston gazed around the space in silence, absorbing the impact of all they had built. He took a deep breath and turned to Linda. "I don't know how to thank you, Linda," he began, his voice choked but sincere. "Thank you for never giving up on me even when I didn't deserve anything. If it weren't for you, I'd probably have lost myself forever." Linda, catching him off guard, smiled and shook her head. "It wasn't just you who changed, Halston. I've learned so much from all of this, too. I learned the value of forgiveness and redemption, and how it's possible to build something great from the ruins. For a long time I held on to resentment, but today I realized that what happened between us served to transform us," she replied, her gaze firm yet affectionate. Halston looked at her, feeling the depth of her words. They had traveled a journey that not only redeemed them but also created a solid connection between them. He took her hand and squeezed it, a simple gesture that expressed all the gratitude he felt. That exchange of glances carried a silent promise to continue transforming lives, and both felt that fate had guided them there for a reason much greater than they could understand. As they were closing the bakery, an elderly woman appeared at the door. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane, but the sparkle in her eyes indicated that she was determined to speak with Halston. He recognized her as she approached. She was a customer from years ago, someone he had barely noticed back then, but now she bore an intriguing expression. "Mr. Halston," she said with an unexpected smile. "I never imagined I would see you like this, helping the community. I don't know if you remember me, but I was once served by you at the bank, and I remember very well how rigid and, well, unkind you were." Halston chuckled, a bit embarrassed but at peace. "Yes, I remember, ma'am, and you're absolutely right. I was a difficult man back then," he replied with serene honesty. The woman studied Halston for a moment and then nodded, as if satisfied with his response. "Today I see that you have changed, and that is a rare thing. I wanted you to know that you are forgiven, and witnessing this transformation fills my heart with hope," she said, gently squeezing his hand. Halston smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him as Linda, standing beside him, watched the scene with a mix of admiration and affection. The woman walked away, but her words continued to resonate. Halston and Linda closed the bakery, aware that the cycle of transformation, which had begun with such deep pain and resentment, had finally come full circle. They walked together now, at peace, carrying with them the desire to keep alive the flame of hope and redemption they had built together.
This story showed us how life can transform even the hardest of hearts, and how sometimes a second chance can mean everything. Linda and Halston, coming from such different paths, found together the strength to overcome past resentments and pains, building something meaningful not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. It's a lesson in forgiveness, empathy, and the human capacity for reinvention. What would the world be like if we could all learn to forgive and support each other like this? What did you think of this journey of transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss what's next. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. This really helps us grow and bring more inspiring stories to you. And don't miss the next video by clicking on the card now on your screen. Thank you for watching and see you next time.